Robert Kiyosaki was 9 years old when he asked a grown man to make him rich. The man laughed, not unkindly. He said, "All right, show up Saturday morning." That single Saturday would turn into one of the most widely read money books ever written. And it starts with something almost every kid can relate to. Kiyosaki had a rich friend and a poor father, and he couldn't understand why the smarter of the two men was the one struggling. This is Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. Kiyosaki grew up with two father figures. His biological father, the one he calls Poor Dad, was highly educated, a university department head working toward a doctorate, well respected in his field. His best friend Mike's father, the one he calls Rich Dad, never finished the 8th grade. And yet, according to Kiyosaki, one of these men would go on to build a business empire. The other would spend much of his life in financial stress, despite the fancy title. Kiyosaki says the entire book is built on that contradiction. Two men, similar income at times, completely different relationships with money, and it all started to unfold. At a convenience store, on a Saturday morning, for 10 cents an hour. Part 1. The rich don't work for money. Rich Dad agreed to teach young Robert and his son Mike how to get rich. On one condition, they'd work for him first. 10 cents an hour. Saturdays. Dusting cans on a shelf. After a few weekends of this, Robert was furious. 10 cents an hour felt like an insult. So, on his own father's advice, he marched in and demanded better pay. Rich Dad's response wasn't what anyone expected. He offered to stop paying them completely. "Work for free," he said, "or walk away." Confused and a little humiliated, the boys kept showing up anyway, and it was during those unpaid Saturdays, hanging around a store that regularly threw out its unsold comic books, that Robert noticed something. Nobody was allowed to resell those comics, but nobody said anything about lending them. So the boys gathered the discarded comic books, set up shop in Mike's basement, hired Mike's little sister to run the front desk, and opened a comic book library, 10 cents admission. Read as many as you like. It worked. For a few months, two 9-year-olds were running a small, profitable little business, entirely their own idea. It eventually shut down after a scuffle broke out in the makeshift library. But by then, Rich Dad's point had already landed. He hadn't taught them a trade. He taught them to stop waiting for a paycheck and start looking for an opportunity instead. But that raises a bigger question. If working for a wage isn't really the path to wealth, then what actually is? Rich Dad had an answer, and it involved a word most families never taught their children at all. Part 2. Why teach financial literacy? Rich Dad's next lesson centered on two words most people think they already understand: asset and liability. His definition was almost uncomfortably simple. An asset puts money into your pocket. A liability takes money out of it. Here's where it gets controversial. Kiyosaki argues that most people believe their own home is an asset, when by his definition, it's actually a liability because of the mortgage, taxes, maintenance, and interest constantly draining money out rather than putting money in. He says this single misunderstanding is one of the biggest reasons everyday working people struggle financially, even when their income looks respectable on paper. The pattern he describes for most middle-class households goes like this: earn a salary, spend it on liabilities disguised as assets, and never actually build a column of things that generate income on their own. The wealthy, he says, follow a completely different pattern. They acquire assets first, and let those assets eventually pay for the liabilities and luxuries. So, if the house isn't the asset, and the paycheck isn't the answer, what's left? Kiyosaki says the wealthy figured out something that has nothing to do with the job title at all. Part 3. Mind your own business. Here's a distinction Kiyosaki makes that trips a lot of people up. Your profession is not your business. You might work as an accountant, a manager, an engineer. That's your profession. But Rich Dad's argument is that your actual business is whatever asset column you're quietly building on the side, outside of work hours, regardless of what your job title says. Rich Dad's advice was blunt. Keep your day job for stability if you need to, but pour your extra effort and money into building your own column of assets, rental property, investments, a small business, rather than pouring every spare dollar into looking successful. Most people, he says, spend their entire working lives building someone else's business and call it a career. But even building your own assets runs into a wall most people don't see coming. A system that quietly takes a bigger bite out of the person with less financial knowledge. And Kiyosaki says understanding that system goes back centuries. Part 4. The history of taxes and the power of corporations. Kiyosaki walks through a brief, simplified history lesson here how taxes were originally introduced as temporary measures, often aimed only at the wealthy, and how over time they expanded to the general population. His core argument is that the wealthy responded to taxation by using a tool most employees never touch, the corporation. In his telling, a corporation isn't just a big company, it's a legal structure that changes the order in which money gets taxed and spent. An employee, he explains, typically earns, gets taxed, and then spends whatever is left. A corporation can spend first and get taxed on what remains. Kiyosaki frames this as one of the starkest differences between how employees and business owners are allowed to handle money under the same legal system. But building a corporation, owning assets, understanding tax structure, none of that matters if you can't actually spot a good opportunity when it appears. And Kiyosaki says most people walk right past them every single day. Lesson 5. The rich invent money. This chapter opens with a real estate story from Kiyosaki's own life. A property he came across that was priced far below its real value, because the seller needed to move quickly. Most people, he says, would have walked past that opportunity simply because they didn't have cash sitting around. Kiyosaki's argument is that the rich don't necessarily start with more money. They start by recognizing an opportunity and then get creative about financing it afterward. He calls this inventing money, the ability to see a deal that others miss and structure a way to make it work, rather than waiting until you've saved enough to do it the conventional way. In his view, financial opportunities appear constantly. What's rare isn't the opportunity. It's the financial education needed to actually recognize one. Which brings up an uncomfortable question for anyone chasing a bigger salary. If opportunity and financial creativity matter more than how much you earn, is chasing a raise actually the wrong goal entirely? Lesson 6. Work to learn, not to earn. Kiyosaki shares a decision from his own early career that puzzled almost everyone around him. After finishing school, he took a sales job at a major corporation, not because it paid the most, but because he was terrified of public speaking and rejection, and knew he needed to get good at both. Rich Dad's advice echoed the same theme. Choose jobs and experiences for the skills they teach you, not just a number on the paycheck. Specifically, Rich Dad pointed to 2 skills almost no school teaches directly: sales and marketing, and a broad understanding of how money and business actually work, accounting, investing, law, and how markets move. Kiyosaki's argument is that people who chase only salary often plateau because they never deliberately built the skills that would let them create their own income streams later. People who work to learn keep expanding what they're capable of long after any single job ends. But knowing all of this doesn't automatically make it easy. Kiyosaki spends an entire section of the book on why so many people understand these ideas and still never act on them. Overcoming obstacles. Kiyosaki identifies 5 emotional barriers that keep people stuck even after they understand the financial concepts. Fear of losing money, which keeps people frozen in place. Cynicism, which talks people out of opportunities before they even try. Laziness, often disguised as being too busy to look into anything new. Bad habits, especially around paying yourself last instead of first. And arrogance, assuming that what you don't know can't hurt you. Of all of these, he spends the most time on fear specifically, the fear of failing, which he argues stops far more people than any actual financial mistake ever could. His argument is unusually blunt. The rich aren't necessarily less afraid of losing money. They've simply made peace with the possibility of failure, treating it as part of the process instead of a reason to never begin. Getting started. Toward the end of the book, Kiyosaki offers a short practical list for readers wondering where to actually begin things, like finding a reason strong enough to keep you motivated, practicing financial literacy daily, and treating your own life as a business, even while employed by someone else. None of it is complicated. Most of it is uncomfortable. And that, according to Kiyosaki, is exactly why so few people ever do it. Closing the 2 dads. So, what happened to the 2 men at the center of this story? Kiyosaki's biological father, Poor Dad, the highly educated one, eventually lost his job later in life and struggled financially for years afterward, despite his credentials. Rich Dad, the man with less than an 8th grade education, went on to become one of the wealthiest men in Hawaii, building a business empire that outlived him. Same era, same island. 2 completely different relationships with money. Kiyosaki's point, in the end, isn't that education doesn't matter. It's that there's a specific kind of education, the kind about money itself that almost nobody is formally taught. And whether you learn it early, at 10 cents an hour, or later in life, the way most of us do, Kiyosaki's argument is that it's never too late to start asking the questions 9-year-old Robert asked on that Saturday morning. That's Rich Dad, Poor Dad. If this summary was useful, let me know in the comments which idea surprised you most, and subscribe for more book breakdowns like this one. In the year 1898, a poor boy from rural Virginia got a job as a cub reporter for a small magazine. He was barely 20 years old. He owned 1 suit. His editor sent him on an assignment that seemed, at the time, completely unremarkable. Go interview a series of successful businessmen for a set of profile pieces. Just another week of work. One of the names on his list was Andrew Carnegie. At the time, arguably the richest man on the entire planet, having built an empire out of steel that stretched across the country. The interview was scheduled for 3 hours. It stretched into 3 days. Because somewhere in that conversation, in Carnegie's own study, the old man said something that the young reporter never forgot for the rest of his life. He said there was a secret, not a metaphor, an actual, repeatable formula, sitting underneath the success of every wealthy person Carnegie had ever known, and he believed it could be taught deliberately to absolutely anyone. Then Carnegie tested him. He said he would personally open the door to over 500 of the most successful people in America, inventors, industrialists, self-made millionaires he'd known throughout his life, so this young man could interview every one of them and extract the formula piece by piece. But there was a catch. It would take 20 years, and Carnegie would not pay him a single dollar for any of it. Most people, hearing that offer, would have said no on the spot. 20 years of unpaid work for a formula that might not even be real. The young reporter's name was Napoleon Hill. He said yes within 60 seconds. 20 years later, in the middle of the Great Depression, when much of the country had far more urgent things to worry about than a book on personal philosophy, Hill finally published everything he had learned. Here's the strange part. In over 200 pages, Hill never once tells you the secret in a single sentence. He never says, "Here it is, right here." Instead, he scatters it across 13 principles and forces you to assemble the picture yourself, one true story at a time. We're going to walk through those 13 pieces together, across 2 parts, and by the very end, the picture will be complete. Let's start with the first one, because it begins, appropriately enough, with a man who had absolutely nothing. Desire. More than 30 years before Hill sat down to write any of this, a young man named Edwin Barnes climbed down off a freight train in Orange, New Jersey. He hadn't paid for a ticket. He couldn't afford one. He'd ridden in an empty freight car, the kind meant for cargo, not people, just to get there. He was heading toward one specific building, the laboratory of Thomas Edison, already famous by then as the most celebrated inventor in the world. Here's what makes this story strange. Barnes wasn't hoping for a job. He wasn't hoping to be hired as an assistant, or a technician, or even a salesman. In his own mind, fully formed before he ever set foot in that office, Barnes had already decided he was going to become Edison's business partner. Think about how that sounds from the outside. A broke young man, with no formal education, no connections, no money, showing up unannounced to declare himself the future business partner of one of the most powerful inventors alive. By any reasonable measure, it was absurd. When Barnes finally stood in front of Edison, the inventor later admitted something revealing. He said the young man looked, honestly, like an ordinary tramp. Nothing about his clothing or his appearance suggested he belonged in that office. But there was something else. Edison said there was an expression on the young man's face, a look of total, unshakable determination that convinced him to give Barnes a chance, even though everything about his appearance argued against it. So Edison gave him a job, not a partnership, not even a real title. Just work small, unimportant tasks around the office for very little pay. Barnes took it without complaint. Months passed. He kept showing up. He never once asked for a different position, and he never once mentioned wanting to work anywhere else. In his own mind, every single day in that building was one day closer to the partnership he had already decided was coming. Then, one day, Edison's team finished work on a new invention, a machine designed to record and play back dictation, what would later be called the Ediphone. There was a problem. Edison's own sales staff didn't believe in it. They looked at the machine, decided it wouldn't sell, and refused to take it out to the market. Barnes saw his opening immediately. He went to Edison and said he would sell the machine himself. Edison, likely with very little to lose, agreed. Barnes didn't just sell a few units. He sold it so successfully and with such relentless energy that Edison eventually handed him a contract to distribute the machine across the entire country. Advertisements for it soon carried a tagline that became famous in its own right: invented by Edison, installed by Barnes. Barnes became a millionaire from that single partnership. Hill's point in opening the entire book with this story is almost uncomfortably simple. Barnes did not have money. He did not have training. He did not have a single advantage on paper. What he had, before any of that, was a desire so specific and so consuming that it was visible on his face before he ever spoke a word. Hill calls this kind of desire definite, not a vague wish to be successful someday, but a precise, named target you have decided on and refuse to release. But desire alone raises an obvious problem. If simply wanting something badly enough were the entire secret, then everyone who has ever wished desperately for money would already have it. Clearly, something else has to be present alongside the wanting. Faith. Hill's answer is that desire has to be paired with something most people quietly assume they aren't allowed to feel: complete, unshaken belief that the goal is actually within reach. Not hope. Hope allows for doubt. Hill is describing something closer to certainty, a settled conviction that the outcome is coming, even before there's any tangible evidence of it. He makes a claim here that was controversial even in his own time. that faith is not something you either luckily have or don't. It's a state of mind that can be deliberately built, the same way a muscle can be built through repetition. Specifically, Hill argues that whatever thought you feed your own mind most often, with the most emotional intensity, eventually gets treated by your subconscious as though it were simply true, regardless of whether it started out true or not. Which leads directly into an obvious, practical question. If belief can be built through repetition, what, exactly, does a person actually do, day to day, to build it? Hill's answer is a specific method he calls autosuggestion, a deliberate, repeated instruction you feed to your own subconscious mind until it takes root as though it had always been there. He gets remarkably concrete about the mechanics of this. Write your central goal down in a single, clear sentence. State it out loud, with real feeling behind it, at least twice every day, once when you wake, once before you sleep. Picture yourself already standing in possession of it, in as much vivid detail as you can hold in your mind. To modern ears, some of this sounds like an early ancestor of what we'd now call visualization or affirmations. Hill's underlying argument is that the subconscious mind doesn't actually distinguish between a real lived experience and one that has been vividly and repeatedly imagined. Feed it a specific instruction long enough, with enough emotion behind it, and it begins acting as though the instruction were reality. A fair objection surfaces here almost immediately. Surely you cannot simply wish your way into an expertise you do not actually possess. Desire and belief are one thing, actual capability is another. Hill agrees completely, and this is exactly the gap the next chapter is built to close. Specialized knowledge. Hill draws a sharp, deliberate line between two very different kinds of knowledge: general knowledge and specialized knowledge. General knowledge, he argues, is nearly worthless in the marketplace, no matter how much of it a person accumulates. Universities are full of broadly educated people who never become wealthy. Specialized knowledge, narrow, specific, and organized around one clear purpose, is what the market actually pays for. To make this point, Hill tells a story from a courtroom. Henry Ford, the automobile manufacturer, was once involved in a lawsuit, and during his testimony, an opposing attorney tried to embarrass him publicly. The attorney fired off a rapid series of general knowledge questions, historical facts, obscure trivia, apparently trying to prove that Ford was uneducated and therefore undeserving of his fortune. After enduring a number of these questions, Ford reportedly leaned toward the attorney and said something to the effect of this. He kept a row of buttons on his office desk, and any one of those buttons would summon a man capable of answering any question the attorney could possibly ask within minutes. So why, Ford asked, should he personally clutter his own mind with facts when he could direct other, more specialized minds instead? Hill's argument, drawn directly from this story, is that you do not personally need to hold every piece of knowledge required for your goal. You need access to it through alliances, through hired specialists, through people who already possess what you lack. Wealth, in his framing, is built through organized cooperation, not personal encyclopedic knowledge. But knowledge, even sharply specialized knowledge, still sits completely still on its own. Something has to actually pick it up and turn it into a product, a business, or an opportunity that nobody else has noticed yet. Imagination. Hill calls imagination the workshop of the mind, the exact place where every invention, every business empire, and every fortune he ever studied existed first, before it existed anywhere else in the world. To illustrate just how powerful this workshop can be, Hill tells what he calls the story of the enchanted kettle. Picture an old iron kettle sitting over a small fire in a backyard, stirred slowly by hand. Inside it, a syrupy, unremarkable mixture, being blended by an unnamed pharmacist experimenting quietly with flavors and ingredients. That pharmacist eventually sold the rights to his formula, and the man who purchased it, a druggist named Asa Candler, did something the original inventor never managed to do. Candler looked at that simple syrup, brewed in an old kettle, and saw something no one else had yet seen. a global business. He took that one idea and built it through advertising, distribution, and relentless imagination into a drink sold in nearly every country on earth. You already know its name. It's Coca-Cola. Hill adds a small, personal detail to the story. It was in the very city where that kettle first bubbled that Hill himself later met his own wife, and it was she who first told him the full story behind the drink. He writes that the beverage itself, consumed in moderation, gave him a kind of mental stimulation that helped fuel his own writing. Hill's larger point, stripped of the personal anecdote, is this: an old kettle, a common syrup, and a handful of ordinary ingredients turned into one of the most valuable business empires in modern history, not because the ingredients changed, but because one person's imagination looked at them differently than everyone before him had. He separates imagination into two distinct types. One simply rearranges existing ideas into new combinations, taking things that already exist and connecting them in a way nobody had tried yet. The other produces something that feels like it arrives from nowhere at all, a flash of insight rather than a deliberate assembly. Hill's argument is that the overwhelming majority of fortunes, including the one built from that old kettle, come from the first kind, old ingredients, recombined, which is, in its own way, quietly encouraging. It means the goal was never to have an idea nobody has ever had before. The goal is the willingness to combine existing ideas in a way that everyone else walked straight past. But even a brilliant idea, however imaginative, is still just a picture sitting inside one person's head. Something has to turn that picture into an actual sequence of real executable steps. Organized planning. This is where Hill gets deliberately practical. A desire, however burning, and an idea, however imaginative, both require an actual working plan. And critically, Hill insists that plan needs to be built around a group of people, never attempted entirely alone. He argues that no single person, no matter how talented, possesses all of the knowledge, skill, and experience necessary for major success by themselves. Every substantial fortune he personally studied involved cooperation between multiple minds, all working toward the exact same aim. Hill also includes something refreshingly honest here. He states plainly that plans fail, often, frequently. Even good plans, built by capable people, collapse regularly. His prescribed response to a failed plan is not to abandon the underlying goal. It's to immediately construct a new plan and try again, treating the failure as information rather than a verdict. He goes further, listing out specific qualities he believed effective leaders needed to hold a plan and a team together. Things like courage, self-control, a keen sense of justice, and a willingness to do more than what is strictly required. And he lists, just as specifically, the causes he saw behind failed leadership: an inability to organize small details, unwillingness to perform humble work when necessary, and expecting pay for what one merely knows, instead of for what one actually does with that knowledge. Which brings us to something Hill considered so essential to success. He devoted an entire chapter to it and opened that chapter with one of the most quietly devastating stories in the entire book. It begins with a man who spent someone else's money digging for gold in the ground and stopped digging 3 feet too soon. R.U. Darby's uncle caught gold fever during the gold rush, staked a claim out west, and after weeks of brutal manual labor, actually struck ore. He quietly covered the site back up, went home, gathered investment from relatives and neighbors, Darby included, and returned with the machinery to bring it all to the surface. The first shipment of ore came back rich, one of the richest mines in the state, by early estimates. Then, without warning, the vein simply disappeared. They drilled desperately, searching for it again. Nothing. Deeper into debt with every passing week, Darby and his uncle finally gave up. They sold the machinery to a junk dealer for a few $100s and went home defeated. The junk dealer, before touching a single drill, called in a mining engineer to look at the site. The engineer studied the rock formations and explained that the vein hadn't vanished at all. It had simply shifted, the way veins often do along a fault line. His calculations pointed to one exact spot. They found the gold 3 feet from where Darby had stopped digging. The junk dealer made millions from that mine. Darby, to his enormous credit, didn't let the story end there. Years later, working as a life insurance salesman, he made himself a private promise. He had stopped 3 feet from gold once, and he would never let a single no stop him again. He went on to become one of a small handful of agents in the entire country, selling over $1 million in life insurance every year. Hill's argument here is blunt. Most people quit at the exact moment right before their breakthrough and never find out how close they actually were. Which raises the obvious question, if quitting is this common and this costly, what actually separates the people who push through from the people who don't? Persistence. Hill calls persistence the one quality most people are missing, and the one quality that's entirely within anyone's control, regardless of circumstance. He's remarkably unsentimental about this. Persistence isn't inspiring, he says. It's often boring, repetitive, and unrewarded for long stretches of time. He compares it directly to willpower, arguing that persistence is simply desire, combined with a discipline to keep going after motivation runs out. He also makes a sharper claim. More than 500 of the successful people he personally interviewed told him their biggest breakthrough came immediately after their darkest moment of defeat, not years later, but right after. But persistence alone, grinding away in isolation, has a ceiling. Hill's next idea is about what happens when you stop trying to do it all with just one mind. The power of the mastermind. Hill defines something he calls the mastermind, a group of people working in complete harmony toward one specific goal. His claim is almost mathematical. When 2 or more minds align this way, something is created that's genuinely greater than the sum of the individuals, a kind of third, invisible intelligence that neither person has access to alone. He points to figures like Andrew Carnegie himself, who openly credited his fortune not to his own singular genius, but to a coordinated group of specialists he assembled around him, each contributing something he didn't have. Hill's implication is pointed. No massive fortune in his research was ever built by one person, working entirely alone. But even a perfectly aligned group of people still needs raw energy behind it, some driving force, intense enough to fuel obsessive, sustained effort. Hill's next chapter tackles where that intensity actually comes from, and is the strangest chapter in the entire book. The mystery of sex transmutation. Hill argues that one of the most powerful human emotions, the drive connected to romantic and sexual energy, can be deliberately redirected, channeled, instead of just released, toward ambition, creativity, and work. He points to a long list of historical figures known for extraordinary drive and charisma, and argues that many of them were also known for powerful romantic energy, and that the two, in his view, are drawing from the very same well. His central claim is that this redirection, taking an intense emotional and physical drive and consciously pointing it at a creative or professional goal, instead is one of the most underused sources of ambition available to any person. It's easily the most debated chapter in the book, but Hill includes it deliberately, arguing that the emotion behind desire matters just as much as the desire itself, which leads naturally into where he believed all of this was actually being processed the whole time. The subconscious mind. Hill describes the subconscious as a kind of translator, the part of the mind that takes whatever thought you feed it most consistently, whether that thought is fear or confidence, and quietly converts it into your actual real-world results. His argument is that the subconscious doesn't filter for whether a thought is good for you. It simply acts on whatever gets repeated with the most emotional intensity, which is precisely why he insisted, earlier in the book, on writing your goals down and repeating them aloud, with feeling not as a motivational ritual, but as a deliberate attempt to feed the subconscious a specific instruction, rather than leaving it to absorb whatever fear or doubt happens to be loudest that day. But the subconscious, in Hill's model, doesn't operate in isolation. It works alongside a physical organ he believed was capable of something far stranger than simply storing memories. The brain. Hill, writing in the 1930s, describes the brain as a kind of broadcasting and receiving station capable, in his theory, of picking up thought vibrations from other minds, not just generating its own. This is one of the more scientifically speculative ideas in the book, and Hill knew it. He leaned on it anyway, using it to explain how a group of people, deeply focused on the same goal, sometimes seem to arrive at similar ideas independently, almost as if they were tuned to the same frequency. It's a strange, almost mystical turn for what began as a book about business and money, and Hill takes it even further in the very next chapter. The sixth sense. Hill calls this his most advanced principle, and admits plainly that it won't make sense to everyone, especially readers approaching the book for the first time. He describes it as a kind of creative wisdom that arrives seemingly from nowhere, sudden ideas, warnings, or hunches that come fully formed without any conscious reasoning behind them. Hill claims this sense only fully develops after someone has already internalized every principle before it, that it's less a separate skill and more what all the other principles eventually turn into, once they're fully absorbed. But Hill closes the entire book with something far more grounded than a sixth sense. He closes with an inventory of the exact things that quietly stop people before any of these principles ever get a chance to work. Outwitting the 6 ghosts of fear. Hill names 6 fears he believes sabotage more lives than any external circumstance ever could. Fear of poverty, fear of criticism, fear of ill health, fear of losing love, fear of old age, and fear of death. His argument is that these fears are rarely conscious. Most people carry them quietly, never naming them directly, which is exactly what allows them to keep operating undetected in the background. Hill's proposed remedy is almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. Identify precisely which fears are operating in your own mind. Name them specifically, and they lose the majority of their power immediately. Which brings us, finally, back to Hill's own life and the single story he chose to close the entire book with. This is the concluding part, Blair Hill. Napoleon Hill's second son, Blair, was born without ears. Doctors told him plainly that the boy would likely never hear or speak. Hill refused to accept it. He made a private, silent decision that his son would hear and began speaking to him, reading to him, and treating him as though the hearing were simply delayed, not absent. As Blair grew, some degree of hearing did develop. Hill also taught him something else entirely, that his condition wasn't a limitation to hide, but something that made people pay closer attention to him, an asset rather than a deficit. At just 7 years old, Blair snuck out to sell newspapers on the street against his mother's fears for his safety, and turned a few borrowed cents into his first real profit. By adulthood, with the help of an early hearing device, Blair's hearing had improved dramatically, and he went on to build a career helping other people with hearing loss. Hill placed this story last for a reason. Every principle in this book, desire, faith, persistence, imagination, had already played out, in miniature, inside his own home, years before he ever wrote them down as a formula. So, back to Andrew Carnegie's original claim, the secret he told a young reporter about all those decades ago. Hill never states it in one single sentence, but by the end of the book, it's hard to avoid the conclusion. The secret was never a formula, a shortcut, or a trick. It was simply this, that a thought, held with enough intensity and backed by enough persistence, tends to shape the world around it, whether that world is a business, a mine, or a young boy who was never supposed to hear his own father's voice. That's Think and Grow Rich. If this breakdown was useful, let me know in the comments which chapter surprised you most. And subscribe for more deep dives into the books that shaped how the world thinks about success. Here's a strange fact. When a Vermont janitor named Ronald Reed died in the year 2014 at 92 years old, almost no one who knew him had any idea what he was actually worth. He'd spent 25 years working at a gas station, then another 17 years, part-time, sweeping floors at a department store. He never went to college. He wore the same coat for years until it needed a safety pin just to stay closed. When his will was read, it turned out Ronald Reed was worth $8 million. No lottery ticket, no inheritance, no secret business. He had simply saved what little he could, put it into solid, boring stocks, and left it alone for decades. Now, here's the other half of this story. That same year, a man named Richard Fuscone made headlines too, but for the opposite reason. Fuscone was Harvard educated, a former executive at a major Wall Street firm. He had the resume, the education, the connections that Ronald Reagan never had. He also had massive debt, a lifestyle way beyond what he could sustain, and when the financial crisis hit, it wiped him out completely. He filed for bankruptcy. Same era, same economy, wildly different endings. So here's the question this video is actually built around. What did an uneducated janitor understand about money that a Harvard-trained Wall Street executive didn't? The answer isn't in a textbook. It's in a book called The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. And once you understand the idea underneath it, you'll never look at a paycheck, a stock chart, or your own bank account the same way again. Let's start with the first piece of the puzzle. No one is crazy here, something uncomfortable to admit. The way you think about money is not the same way everyone else thinks about money. Not even close. If you grew up watching your parents thrive during a booming economy, you probably believe investing is safe, even easy. If you grew up watching your family lose everything in a crash, you probably believe the whole system is rigged against you. Neither one of you is wrong. You're just running on completely different personal history. And this explains something that seems baffling on the surface. Why do smart, capable people sometimes make financial choices that look completely irrational from the outside? The truth is, they're not irrational at all. They're reasonable, given what they've personally lived through. But that raises a much bigger question. If everyone's experience with money is this different, how do you explain two people living through the exact same historical moment, ending up on opposite ends of fortune through no real fault of either one? That's not hypothetical. It actually happened. And it happened to two teenagers who were best friends. Luck and risk. In the year 1968, there were roughly 303 million teenagers in the world. Only about 300 of them attended a particular private school in Seattle called Lakeside, and Lakeside happened to be one of the only schools on Earth that owned a computer. One of those 300 students was a 13-year-old named Bill Gates. Gates has said it plainly himself. Without that school, without that computer, there is no Microsoft. That's not humility, that's math. Start with 300 million, end with 300. That's 1 in a million luck. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. Gates had a close friend at that same school, a boy named Kent Evans. By Gates' own account, Evans was just as sharp, just as driven, arguably the best student in their class. The two of them dreamed about building something together. Kent Evans never got the chance. He died in a mountaineering accident before he ever graduated high school. Same school, same talent, same opportunity. One got 1 in a million luck, the other got 1 in a million risk. Housel's point is chilling once you sit with it. Luck and risk are the exact same force, just pointed in opposite directions. Which means every time you look at someone wildly successful or someone who lost everything, you're only seeing half the story. So what do you actually do with that? If you can't control luck, and you can't fully protect yourself from risk, is there anything you can control at all? There is. And it has almost nothing to do with money itself. Never enough some of the wealthiest, most accomplished people in modern history have thrown away their careers, their reputations, sometimes their freedom, because they could not answer one simple question. How much is enough? Housel points to hedge fund managers, once worth more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes, who still took on illegal insider trades to get more. Not because they needed it, because their ambition had no ceiling. And when ambition has no ceiling, there is no amount of success that will ever feel like enough. That single idea, knowing where your finish line is, turns out to be one of the hardest financial skills that exists. Harder than picking stocks. Harder than reading a balance sheet. But if wanting more is so dangerous, why does everyone keep telling you to think bigger, dream bigger, want more? What if the entire game everyone's playing has a shortcut, hiding in plain sight, something almost boring, that quietly builds fortunes while nobody's watching? It does, and it explains why Ronald Reed, the janitor from our opening story, ended up richer than almost anyone expected. The quiet power of compounding Warren Buffett is worth well over $100 billion. Ask most people why, and they'll say it's because he's the greatest stock picker who ever lived. That's not really the answer. The truth is stranger. The vast majority of Buffett's fortune was built after he had already qualified for retirement. He didn't get rich by earning the highest returns. He got rich by earning pretty good returns and never stopping. For over 7 decades. That's the part our brains struggle to accept. Compounding doesn't look impressive while it's happening. For years, it looks like almost nothing at all. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, everything happens at once. This is exactly what a janitor with no financial training understood, and what plenty of Wall Street professionals miss completely. The money isn't made in the exciting years. It's made in the boring, uneventful decades in between. But here's the twist almost nobody sees coming. Getting money and keeping money are not the same skill. In fact, they require the exact opposite mindset. And confusing the two is exactly what has taken down some of the most successful people in financial history. Getting wealthy versus staying wealthy. Building wealth usually takes big swings, optimism, risk-taking, putting yourself out there. Keeping wealth requires almost the opposite. Humility, fear of losing what you've built, and a refusal to be reckless just because things are going well. Richard Fuscone, the executive from our opening story, built an impressive career, taking exactly those kinds of bold risks. But when the crisis came, he never switched gears. He kept swinging for the fences with money he could no longer afford to lose. Ronald Reed never had that problem. He was never tempted to gamble at all, because he was never playing that kind of game in the first place. So, if bold risk-taking can build a fortune, and also destroy one, how do you know how much risk is actually safe to take? The answer might be the single most practical idea in the entire book. Room for error. Here's a question worth sitting with. What happens to your plan when your plan doesn't go according to plan? Housel argues the people who survive longest in the world of money aren't the ones chasing the highest possible returns. They're the ones who leave themselves enough room to absorb bad luck, bad timing, or a bad decision, without it wiping them out completely. Think of it as insurance against your own uncertainty about the future. You don't actually know what's coming. None of us do. So building in a margin of safety isn't pessimism. It's just honesty. But here's an unsettling wrinkle to all of this. The plan you're building room for error around, right now, is a plan for a version of you that may not even exist in 20 years. You'll change your mind. There's a strange finding in psychology. People are remarkably good at recognizing how much they've changed over the past 10 years, and remarkably bad at believing they'll change at all over the next 10. Which means the dream house, the career plan, the retirement vision you're building toward right now might feel completely wrong to the person you become later. This doesn't mean stop planning. It means be careful about making extreme, irreversible decisions based on who you are today, because today's version of you and the future version of you may want very different lives. So, if even our own future selves are unpredictable, here's a question worth asking. What does real wealth even look like? You might be picturing it wrong right now, and the answer connects directly back to that janitor in Vermont. Wealth is what you don't see. When you see someone driving an expensive car, what do you actually think? Probably not, that driver must be disciplined and wealthy. You just admire the car. Maybe you picture yourself behind the wheel. Here's the twist. Nobody's admiring the driver. They're admiring the object and quietly imagining themselves in the driver's place. Which means spending money to look wealthy is often solving completely the wrong problem. Ronald Read never looked wealthy. He looked, by every outward appearance, like exactly what he was, a retired gas station worker in an old coat. That's precisely why his fortune stayed intact for decades. Real wealth isn't the car in the driveway. It's the money that was never spent, the investment that was never touched. It's invisible by definition. So, if wealth is invisible, what's actually the point of saving it? If you're never going to show it off, why bother at all? The answer is the most quietly radical idea in the entire book. Save money for a reason you can't. Yet, name most people only save money when they're saving toward something specific. A house, a car, retirement. But Housel makes a different case entirely. The most valuable thing savings buys you is options you don't even know you'll need yet. A financial cushion means you can wait for a good opportunity instead of being forced into a bad one. It means you can walk away from a job that's draining you. It means an emergency doesn't turn into a spiral. In other words, savings isn't really about the item you're saving for. It's about buying control over your own time, which might be the highest return money can ever pay you. And that idea leads to one final, uncomfortable truth about how to actually use money wisely, one that goes against almost everything traditional finance teaches. Be reasonable, not rational. Traditional finance often assumes people are perfectly rational calculators, always making the mathematically optimal choice. Housel pushes back hard on this. A strategy that's technically optimal on paper, but unbearable to actually live with, will fail, because you won't stick with it when things get hard. A strategy that's slightly less perfect, but lets you actually sleep at night, will beat the theoretically perfect one every single time because you'll still be following it decades later. Optimize for what you can stick with, not for what looks best in a spreadsheet. Coming back to Ronald Read, so let's return to where we started. Ronald Read never earned a big salary, never had an impressive title, never made a bold headline-worthy trade. What he did have was patience, humility, and decades of letting a boring, unremarkable habit run uninterrupted. Richard Fuscon had nearly every advantage on paper, the education, the resume, the connections, and none of it protected him because he never developed the one skill that actually matters. Housel put it simply, Ronald Read was patient. Richard Fuscon was greedy. That's all it took to raise an enormous gap in education and experience between the two of them. You don't need to be the smartest person in the room to build wealth. You need to be the one still in the room, decades later, having never blown yourself up along the way. That's the psychology of money. If this breakdown helped you see money a little differently, let me know in the comments which idea hit you hardest. And subscribe if you want more deep dives into the books that quietly change how people think about money, time, and decisions.